Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another segment here on Project Purpose. For those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education on a week-by-week basis. And today's focus of discussion is education. On the conversation on education, I want to talk about the demarcation between persistence, persuasion, and coercion. And this is an important conversation because I don't think that we spell it out so explicitly, but it is the I think it's the informal education that I have had since I was very young that has really informed the way that I show up and the ways that I respond to persistence, persuasion, and coercion. And I think this is and I think that is also very critical and very key that we recognize in ourselves which of these specific mechanisms we turn to when it is the case that we're communicating something that will translate in a trajectory that means something to us or something significant to us, and also recognize how we need to respond as relates to how we should be responding or how we should be sort of positioning ourselves when it is the case that someone is being persistent or when someone is being persuasive or coercive. And so this, for us to kick off this conversation, I need to set the tone, I need to set the context for when I had to learn and really recognize the demarcation between these three communication styles based on how they escalate. And I learned this in high school. And so for those of you who aren't aware, I am Canadian. I was born in Alberta, grew up in a small little town east of Toronto, about 45 minutes east. And so I grew up in a town, so I grew up actually in a little place called Port of Newcastle. So I grew up in a lakeside community. That's where I lived when I went to high school. But before that, I lived in Curtis. There's these little town areas. You can take a look at it on the map if you want to, but they're just these little towns east of Oshawa, which is one of the bigger cities east of Toronto. And so these little towns are kind of clustered together, and there's a little bit of a community around them based on the French immersion circuit. So because the school district was quite small, the demarcation between persistence, persuasion, and coercion. And this is an important conversation because I don't think that we spell it out so explicitly. I think it's the informal education that I have had since I was very young that has really informed the way that I show up and the ways that I respond to persistence, persuasion, and coercion. And I think that is also very critical and very key that we recognize in ourselves which of these specific mechanisms we turn to when it is the case that we're communicating something that will translate in a trajectory that means something to us or something significant to us, and also recognize how we need to respond, how we should be responding, or how we should be positioning ourselves when it is the case that someone is being persistent or when someone is being persuasive or coercive. For us to kick off this conversation, I need to set the tone, I need to set the context for when I had to learn and really recognize the demarcation between these three communication styles based on how they escalate. And I learned this in high school. And so for those of you who aren't aware, I am Canadian. I was born in Alberta, grew up in a small little town east of Toronto, about 45 minutes east. So I grew up actually in a little place called Port of Newcastle in a lakeside community. That's where I lived when I went to high school. But before that, I lived in Curtis. There's these little town areas. You can take a look at it on the map if you want to, but they're just these little towns east of Oshawa, which is one of the bigger cities east of Toronto. And so these little towns are kind of clustered together, and there's a little bit of a community around them based on the French immersion circuit. So because the school district was quite small, I was actually going to school in the same district as my father. My father was a teacher. He was a French teacher actually in the neighborhood that I grew up in. But with my neighborhood, there was a circuit that was sort of the Catholic school circuit, the public school circuit, and the French immersion circuit. And when you're a French immersion, then across these three towns, so Curtis, Bowmanville, and Port of Newcastle, you would be put in different schools that will accommodate your parents' desire, I guess, to speak in French. And so when I entered middle school, and remember, I was quite sheltered. I was homeschooled during my primary school years, and I was put in school permanently since grade 7 onwards. But it was a really difficult transition, mostly because I wasn't socially mature, and we were in an environment between Curtis, Bowmanville, and Newcastle where there was a lot of aggression towards women. And a lot of this aggression towards women now, in hindsight, they didn't want to call it that, but it was sexual repression from the boys in the class, right? And so because of that, a lot of the women, not just myself, experienced a lot of aggression by our male counterparts. We experienced a lot of aggression, and by the time we made it to high school, so by the time I was living in Port of Newcastle, I was going to Bowmanville High School, which is a French immersion high school. At that point, the violence against women was full blown. And it was to such an extent that rather than focus on the boys and trying to teach them to consent, because I don't think even now we're there yet by way of like education around consent, what they did was recognizing that a lot of my female peers were being subject to violence and sexual violence by their male peers, where they taught us a lot about the separation between persistence, persuasion, and coercion. And so much so that many of my gym classes, as I was going up in years in my high school, were about self-defense, like female self-defense. So just imagine the level of violence that I grew up in against women if some of the curriculum changed to teach women, to teach us high school girls self-defense. And part of that education also came language. And so this language is really something that has informed the way that I show up in environments where I feel like the interaction that I'm having is one where the person's being persistent, the person's being persuasive, or the person's being coercive. But as a woman in this environment where I was being educated without so many words being exchanged on how to respond, how to position yourself, if it is the case of someone is being persistent, when someone's being persuasive, and when someone's being coercive. And so the difference between the three is very, very interesting and something that I want you to keep in mind. And I think that for persistence is typically just very irritating, right? If someone's being persistent, they have their agenda that they're trying to push. They have a specific outcome that they want to push, and they don't really care to hear no. And I think that it's really important that we talk about when we are engaging with one another, when we're having conversations where there's outcomes that are desired that might not be the same on either part. For it to be a constructive conversation, it needs to be a persuasive conversation. A persuasive conversation is a conversation of two minds coming together to find a path that makes sense for both of them, which means both parties have an interest to explore and to collaborate to find a path that works best for both parties, right? But if someone's approaching a conversation with the intention of having their way, that becomes a very toxic, very maladaptive type of communication. And so I think that a lot of what we were told, a lot of our education, our informal education, was about how to identify when someone was not interested in collaborating and in working with you to find a desired outcome for the both parties, but when someone was trying to push their agenda. And while persistence was in and of itself something that I have always been raised to be very irritating, it's not an entirely intelligent way of trying to get your point across. It's just really repeating the same thing over and over again and trying to break down someone's will. I've always been taught that if someone's being persistent and they don't really care about what you have to say, then that is enough to disengage. If someone really is just trying to find a way to break you down and just have you say yes out of defeat, then why engage in that conversation to the point where you're exhausted and want to throw in the towel? Like, just cut the conversation short and walk away. And so that was what I was taught in high school. Like, if someone isn't understanding the word no, if someone's being persistent and your no is not getting you anywhere, then they're just trying to break down your resolve. They don't really care about your point of view. They don't care about your opinion. They just want to get their way by trying to break you down. And so the best way to disengage from someone like that, who's just really one-track mind, like very focused on one thing, is to disengage and to remove yourself from that situation. And even as an adult, I find when someone is being persistent, like the first thing that I try to do is just create distance, because I'm not going to let someone wear me down, right? If I know that this is not a trajectory that works for me, it doesn't work for the initiatives or the objectives that I myself am driving, or it doesn't work for the teams that I'm supporting, then why am I going to engage in a conversation to the point where I feel exhausted and concede to something that isn't aligned to the vision, isn't aligned to my own personal desires and wants, isn't aligned to our values, so on and so forth. So you just disengage from that. Now, the other communication style that is fairly destructive and also the more insidious is coercion. And so coercion is where someone is again being persistent, but that persistence is also coupled with intimidation and aggression. Coercion has been something that I've always been taught to identify and try to circumvent as much as possible, because at the end of the day, like, this person wants what they want to such an extent that they're going to escalate the level of aggression that they put towards you to get away, because for them it's not just they hope that you're going to say yes, is that they expect that at the end of the day that they're going to get what they want regardless of whether you say no or yes. And so the difference between persistence and coercion is that persistence is really just hoping to get you to say yes. There isn't going to be a move forward until there's consent, even if that consent, it's not like they've leveraged integrity or they've been mindful of you, of your desires in getting that yes, but they need that yes to feel comfortable moving forward. Whereas coercion is different is a different kind of beast in that their expected outcome is going to be the yes, right? At the end of the day, like, they're going to get their way. And so as a woman, I have always been taught to be very mindful about signals of coercion, like someone who, if they don't hear what they want, they're going to increase their level of aggression, and they're happy to take what it is that I'm not willing to give. It's not just in like universities where rape culture is rampant, especially across North America, it's a really big deal. But even in conversation, right? When you're having a conversation with someone where you're both trying to figure out a way to collaborate, to innovate, and to work together, you can tell when someone's using coercive tactics when it is the case that you say no and you explain your reasoning, and then the aggression escalates, right? Someone who approaches a conversation with a place of entitlement, they feel entitled to the desired outcome that they have in mind, is trying to coerce you. That is aggressive and violent ways of communicating, and that's also a way of communicating that tells you that this person does not value you, they don't value your perspective, they don't value your point of view. They see those three things as an impediment and as a blocking point to them getting their way, right? And so we want to stay away from coercion, but we also want to call out coercion for what it is. When someone feels entitled to have you participate in a specific way, that's not healthy engagement. That's not a healthy way of interacting with other people. And in fact, the best way to deal with coercion is boundaries. You put boundaries in place and you make sure that those boundaries are respected. You enforce those boundaries, because honestly, without boundaries and without appropriate structured ways of reinforcing those boundaries, they expect to get walked all over, right? Because someone who is using coercion is someone who's comfortable with intimidation, they're comfortable with aggression, they're comfortable with violence. And also recognize that violence is on a spectrum. Violence is anything from yelling, from raising your voice, from speaking in a specific way to undermine, to be condescending, to be patronizing, to be arrogant, all the way to like physically harming somebody. So because I recognize this, when someone's leveraging persistence, I completely cut out and disengage. But when someone's using coercion, I set and start establishing boundaries, because it is inappropriate in every setting for someone to feel like they can be coercive and get what they want. Coercive behavior is maladaptive and toxic behavior. It is not the kind of behavior we ever want to reward, because it's only going to get worse for the next person down the line. So if you recognize that someone is being coercive, that someone is not getting their way, and in not getting their way, they become more aggressive, the level of violence increases, they become more agitated in the way that they communicate with you, then you need to set those boundaries and you need to enforce them. They will only move forward. The only type of communication that really engages thoughtful collaboration, thoughtful exploration, and a trajectory that really combines the best of both minds is persuasiveness. It's when you have a point of view, you have a desired outcome, but you're open and ready to explore other possibilities. You recognize that your way isn't the end all be all. You're not the holy grail of the best moves forward. There are many ways to roam, right? There are many ways to gut a fish, essentially, if you come from a small town like I do, and that was the analogy that you used. And so if you are talking to someone who doesn't see that, they don't see the value in taking in different perspectives, they don't recognize that their trajectory could probably be enhanced and evolved in a way that benefits everyone if they just listen, if they allow themselves to be persuaded, and if they're open to being persuaded. And I'm always open to being persuaded. Like, I have my vision of things, I have the ways that I like to move forward, but I'm always open to suggestions if they make sense, right? If you say something that makes sense, then I'm obviously going to be all for it, because I want to be successful at the end of the day. I want to collaborate and participate in something that evolves into something beautiful. I don't want to put my energy into things that are going to fail, and I think the best way for failure is to be closed off to alternate perspectives and alternate opinions, especially when you have different expertise playing into the conversation. And so it's really, really important that we recognize when we are having a conversation with someone, what kind of conversation are we having? Are we having a conversation where someone's really just trying to get your yes no matter how they get it? Are they trying to be persistent? And think about like the telemarketer who won't let you off the phone, right? Like, how do you disengage from that? You just hang up the phone. You don't need to wait until they wear you down. Like, you can just disengage completely. Or someone who's being coercive, where no is not an answer that they want to hear, and they're willing to increase the aggression, increase the hostility in order to get the answer that they're looking for. That is coercion, and that needs to be nipped right in the bud, right? And if someone's being coercive in their language, they're being aggressive in their language, they're operating from a place of entitlement, that is toxic behavior that needs to be addressed immediately. And the best way to address it is to enforce boundaries with real consequences if that person feels inclined to continue to engage that way. They need to recognize that that's not the way that we engage in civil conversations. Like, we're not going to be the kinds of people who take what they want when they won't be given it. I mean, that's really hostile. That doesn't make anyone feel psychologically or even physically safe. And there's a lot of people who operate that way. But I think the best way to address coercive behavior is to, again, establish boundaries and make sure that those boundaries aren't crossed. And sometimes the best way to establish and maintain a boundary is to not put yourself in situations where, you know, you have no control over the variables if that person decides to cross that boundary. But for most of us, we can circumvent the majority of those situations in adulthood. But it's important that we recognize that if someone's being coercive, if someone doesn't understand that no means no, if someone feels entitled to a yes, that's a very dangerous situation to be in. And yeah, you need to escalate, you need to get support. That is not an interaction where you don't have a defense or a support system at your side, because that can be a very ugly situation very quickly. And so I wanted to have that conversation. I think we all need to start being very mindful and being very aware of the kinds of conversations we're having. If we're having kind of conversation where someone really doesn't care about our point of view, they just want what they want a specific outcome, and they don't really care to manage themselves with integrity to get it. They're just trying to break you down until you say what it is that they want you to say so that they can feel confident moving forward. That's not the kind of conversation you want to have. That's not the kind of person that you want to give an excessive amount of energy to. Like, the moment that you realize that that person really doesn't care about your point of view, like your no doesn't mean anything to them, it's just an annoyance to them, then disengage completely. But if someone's using coercion, then you need to really make sure that you set yourself up for success and not having any of your personal boundaries or limits crossed, because that person doesn't care about you saying yes or no. They're in conversation to take what it is that won't be given. And so those kinds of conversations are so unhealthy. They're so maladaptive. They don't make anyone feel psychologically safe, not as a participant or engaged in those kinds of conversations. And so it's really important that you establish boundaries and you maintain those boundaries, and that you also enforce consequences. So hopefully that is enlightening. It gives you the information that you need to move forward with that additional insight. So remember, coercion, persistence, not fun, not things that you want to engage in, and persuasive is the only move forward. In any case, that was a conversation for today. That is it, but definitely not all. Now, if you are interested in cultivating self-mastery, if you want to join in on live conversations that are more interactive, then definitely check out our website. We have live events. We have a calendar for the entire year. And if it is the case that you're interested, we do have parent-child workshops, because we do believe in teaching leadership skills even in children, cultivating grit, perseverance, and resilience in each child by focusing on individuality. And we have 4 core modules that focus on the fundamentals of individuality, and that's focusing on cultivating self-concept, autonomy, self-efficacy, and compassion. So definitely check out our website, tune in, and if you haven't already, subscribe. It really does help us a lot. Join our game changer community, giving us the opportunity to play a small role in your journey. We are on the road to 1K, so definitely be sure to hit that like button to follow across all of our social media platforms, and I look forward to chatting with all of you very soon. We'll talk to you later.